Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drill Down. Well, it's another massive case of welfare fraud. But what about the underlying political networks that are enabling and even encouraging this fraud? We're going to unpack that today with Eric Eggers, the co-host of this program. Eric, how are you?
No less than a fraud expert, Peter Schweizer.
So a massive case in Minnesota, $1 billion. That's what they believe. It could be larger in fraud that's taking place. We're going to talk about that case. It's not unique to Minnesota. This is a national problem. And I think what's often forgotten is people get all excited and upset about the amount of money that's stolen, the fact that people are spending this money for what it's not intended. But this keeps happening because powerful political people kind of sort of want it to keep happening.
One of the things that we talk about often here at the Government Accountability Institute is the perverse incentive structure that allows less than ideal outcomes to perpetuate. And unfortunately, when it comes to welfare fraud, that's exactly the case. There's a number of incentives that all line up towards allowing fraud to grow and happen. And by the way, the $1 billion figure you threw out, and we're talking about the Minnesota fraud, the Minnesota Public Employees Union, at least one of them, estimates that it actually may be closer to $10 billion in fraud just in Minnesota. So imagine if that's one state in a collection of programs, imagine larger networks of states and how big that actual number might be.
Yeah. So here's what we know in the Minnesota case. We know that it's at least $1 billion, maybe much higher, as you said. This money was intended for feeding children, helping homeless families, and providing autism therapy. And what they ended up doing is taking this money, putting it in their own pockets, and buying expensive vehicles, Teslas, Porsches. They bought lakefront homes. They went on Dubai shopping sprees, beachside resorts abroad. This is sort of the thing that happens with these scams. And it was based primarily in the Somali community, which is Minneapolis. And they're a powerful political force, as we're going to talk about a little bit later in this podcast. So that seems to be a relevant fact as well.
They would be a powerful political force if racists like you would stop attacking them. No, but that's exactly the issue. And we're going to play audio unbelievably from a meeting that some of these Somali fraudsters would have with the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, in which, allegations of racism were used to try to get him to protect them from oversight. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Minnesota thing is one example. We're going to talk about other examples of fraud that are, because it's not just Minnesota, but the whole, let's start with this from an incentive standpoint. Mm-hmm. The Biden administration did lots of stuff incredibly poorly. And it wasn't, unfortunately, just the borders that were open. I mean, COVID happened, and anybody who's involved in welfare administration will tell you when you have a natural disaster like a hurricane, when you have an emergency and you're trying to get a lot of aid to people who need it
throw money at it.
You're just throwing it out there, and there's very little oversight. And unfortunately, COVID was this perfect storm of lots of money going out the door, and people weren't meeting in person, so there's very little oversight that was happening. But even after that, the Biden administration, as they were leaving office, had one kind of final farewell gift to people who wanted to take these welfare programs for as much as they could.
This was in December of 2024.
December of 2024. So Joe Biden has lost the election, but the guy who's in charge of the Council for Medicaid Services, a guy named Daniel Sy, who is noteworthy in another writes a letter to states, and it says this is the guidance for how they are to administer these Medicaid programs. Quote, this is the guy who's in charge of these programs at the federal level under Joe Biden, December 2024. Quote, as discussed in more detail below, with narrow exceptions, federal law does not permit Medicaid agencies to recoup funds from or lock out from Medicaid coverage a beneficiary who the state determined abused or defrauded the Medicaid program.
Wow, that is stunning, and it's something that was written down, and it goes to this issue of incentive structures. Why would you issue a letter like that? Why would you want that to be your posture? And the problem is that these programs pump all this money into these congressional districts and these states, and these politicians don't really care where the money comes from. They don't really care where it's going. It's enriching their community. It's circulating money in their community. And I think that's one of the powerful incentives at work here.
To the point, when Daniel Sy leaves this office in the federal government and joins the city of San Francisco to become their head of public health, in the announcement letter, it says he brings 2 decades of healthcare experience, where he helped significantly expand healthcare access, among communities most in need.
Including Dubai.
Potentially committing fraud.
Including Dubai, because somebody has to buy those luxury goods. So it's not just a Minnesota problem, as we mentioned. Just very briefly, Arizona, these are all recent cases. A Pakistani national was charged for allegedly orchestrating a $650 million fraud scheme involving Medicaid. In New York, they charged 15 individuals, including pharmacists, for a scheme involving fraudulent billing over $10 billion to Medicare and Medicaid. In Florida, you had several individuals charged in various schemes, including $35 million.
In Medicaid, and once again, remember, because of that Daniel Side letter, you can't kick them out the program.
Yeah, exactly. You can stay in the program even if you've done this. EBT, food stamps, it's not just in the medical field. It's in all these welfare programs. EBT in New York in May of 2025, a U.S. Department of Agriculture, they're the ones that administer the EBT program, was charged with providing EBT license numbers to a criminal network. So in other words, a criminal network can now accept EBT cards. What could go wrong with that? There were 160 unauthorized EBT terminals that were set up in businesses around New York City. Seattle, Washington, in October of 2025, 11 people were arrested in a scheme that involved buying EBT cards and using them at stores, reselling items like food and household goods to other businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not just a Minnesota problem, but Minnesota seems to have a pattern here of history, because you have this recent case, but we reported on an earlier case that again involved this Somali community.
Yeah. So, and ironically, the case that's in the news now, Christopher Rufo breaking some news about this Medicaid fraud and these housing programs that are being abused and money actually ending up in terrorist networks overseas. And that's like the headline from the Chris Rufo reporting. But the fact that these federal officials were able to trace that money and find this fraud stemmed from this original fraudulent program we told you about a couple of years ago. The headline is "The Somali Fraud Ring That Turned Money for Hungry Children into Luxury Empires, and Why Tim Walz and the Democrats Looked the Other Way for Unfathomable Reasons." So it's got now over $1 billion. Its money's bankrolled like G-Wagons, Porsches, lakefront homes. The original story about this feeding program mentioned like gold bars at weddings, and that's how this thing began to be exposed. But over 70 people have been charged with something called Feeding Our Future. It was basically meant to feed people during COVID. They started over 200 food sites, fraudulently reporting, providing more than 125 non-existent meals to children. Now, there's a white woman who's in charge of this. Like, she's been the center of it. Her name is Amy Bach. She was the founder of Feeding Our Future. And then there's a lot of other people who are part of the Somali community, some of whom are very politically connected. Abdi Salah was the former policy aide to Minneapolis mayor. We've got another person who's connected to Ilhan Omar, and you've got somebody who's a former Bernie Sanders campaign person who's not been accused of wrongdoing. But the point is, you've got some politically connected people in the Somali community that were a part of or adjacent to this fraud. And so like this Feeding Our Future program began in 2019. It's got $3 million in federal food aid money. And then COVID happens. 2020 goes to $43 million. And then in 2021, it goes up to $198 million. And so, and of course, this like triggers some alarm bells. By
the way, Bach, who is the head of this program, just to note, when these charges were first announced, she said it was all racism.
Oh, 1,000%. They were notified by allegations. The FBI even kind of says, hey, man, we think there's some problems here. From June 18 to December 2021, the Department of Education, the Minnesota Department of Education that oversees this program, received at least 30 complaints involving Feeding Our Future sites. And in June of 2019, even before like the COVID thing first takes off, they received the first of 2 complaints alleging that Feeding Our Future required kickbacks from vendors. And so at one point, Minnesota Department of Education says, all right, hey, we're going to stop. We're going to pause this. But then they sue 1,000% because it's heavily in the Somali community and they allege racism. And so they were able to kind of kick it back in. Tim Walz, when he was running for re-election of governor, initially said he knew about this problem in 2020. And then it's like, I didn't really know about it. So the warning signs had been there for some time. And the point is like there's allegations of wrongdoing. There's allegations of fraud. but the money, partly because of the racism defense, keeps coming.
Yeah, it keeps coming. A couple things that stand out to me about this particular case and the more recent one, the Feeding Our Future case. Think about this. They're accused of fraudulently claiming that they delivered 125 million meals. That's a lot of meals and a lot of food. And you got to wonder, how is it that that goes undetected? I mean, it's not like, we've got a couple of vans here that are filled with food. 125 million meals is a lot of meals. So to me, it's shocking in the scale and the scope of it.
Yeah. And at the trial, one of the guys who's accused to be like the biggest fraudster who ran this restaurant called Safari Restaurant, they're like, you're telling me you ran 6,000 meals a day through this restaurant? He's like, yeah, absolutely. He goes, but never to kids, though. Like cars would pull up and they say we have 5-6 kids, and we just give them 5-6 kids worth of food, and then we charge the government for it.
Yeah. And the Safari Restaurant is an interesting case because Ilhan Omar got sort of involved in this, not with a criminal activity. There's no evidence of that, but she was connected to this restaurant, and this restaurant was charged for being involved in the fraud. There was a video that the defendant wanted to play in his defense in the fraud. It was a video of Ilhan Omar. What is the story of that video?
The video is her like delivering meals during COVID, like to cars that pull up to it, and they wanted to show the video at his trial just to show kind of what it looked like, and then they ultimately decided not to. But the judge was going to let him, and then of course Ilhan Omar was like, "No, it had nothing to do with this." I mean, do we represent the Somali community? Yes, but not the fraud part.
Well, here's what's interesting to me. So I talked about the scale, the fact it's so big, and this went undetected. Here's the second part of it, and I'm going to get criticized for saying this, but it's absolutely true, and that is when you look at recent immigrant communities in the United States. In other words, people that haven't been here for multiple generations. People that are seniors in that community, that are elders in that community, have a lot of political sway. This has even been the case 100 years ago with the Irish community in Boston. And the point is if you can get the elites within that community behind you politically, you can count on the support of a lot of other people that are the member of that diaspora. Well, and that's what strikes me what happened in Somalia. In other words, you don't want to, if you are a political candidate, particularly on the progressive left in Minnesota, and you want the support of the Somali community, which is a very significant voting bloc, you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to go after somebody who's engaged in fraud because it's going to cost you in terms of getting support in that community. It's very top down in that way.
And actually, to the point, so the Feeding Our Future program was blown up when you had FBI raids that happened in January of 2022. Mm-hmm. But to your point about how politically influential these are, and let's just do this now because I think it sets the table for what happened after the fact, right? Yeah. Like, so because you've got other fraud-ridden programs that continued despite major warning signs. And this is one of them. But so in January 2022, the feds would raid the restaurants, Amy Box House, et cetera, with lots of indictments and charges. Yeah. But in December of 2021, people involved in this program, people who would be charged a month later, had a meeting with one of the most important political figures in the state of Minnesota. So this is a meeting with the Attorney General, Keith Ellison. Mm-hmm. And this is amazing. They're actually saying, listen, Keith Ellison, Attorney General, we, the Somali community, are being wrongfully targeted. We're trying to feed kids. We're trying to do all these things. And these state agencies keep hassling us. Listen to cut one. This is a member of the East African business community, as they refer to themselves. And listen to what they say to Keith Ellison.
But we don't recognize no differences between us. Mm-hmm. We're one, mm-hmm. and we're going to stand up for each other and make sure that we get some things fixed. Absolutely. And let me tell you, just being able to say, just getting the question, just getting the inquiry from the AG is sometimes enough to make people knock it off.
So basically what we're talking about here, General Ellison, is we have systemic patterns of abuse, waste, and fraud from the departments claiming the same from minority business owners. And we've taken it far too long.
Of course I'm here to help. I mean, but let me be clear. I'm not here because I think it's going to help my re-election. Mm-hmm. I don't care about no re-election. Mm-hmm. I voluntarily threw my congressional career away. Mm-hmm. I'm like, I don't want to do it anymore. It's boring to me. So to do this, to do what I'm doing now. So of course, I didn't leave that job to do nothing in this job. I mean, am I going to get more hits than I got by prosecuting a police officer and giving them life in prison? Right? So so let's just go fight these people.
So that's Keith Ellison saying, I'm happy to fight these state agencies on your behalf. And he's referencing as evidence of his political courage, what, Peter Schweizer?
The George Floyd case and the fact that he threw the book at these police officers. A lot of questions now about how that prosecution was handled. It's subject of appeal. But it shows in my mind the kind of bold-faced crassness of how he is trying to pursue these constituents. For him to say, oh, I'm not concerned about re-election. I mean, give me a break. The reason he's there at that meeting, there are other references in this conversation where they're talking about the Somali community's talking about their ability to raise money for political candidates, the fact that they want to get behind people that are supporting their community. We should add, by the way, that this audio came from the Center for the American Experiment in Minneapolis. This was recorded at this meeting that took place in 2021. And I would encourage anybody to look it up online and listen to this, because it's an extensive audio recording. And it really shows you how terrible it looks to see the sausage made with these kinds of retail politicians.
And to the point, later on in the meeting, one of the guys introduces himself to Keith Ellison and says, yeah, I helped Jacob Fry raise a lot of money. And Keith Ellison goes, well, I hope he remembers.
Politicians do.
Yeah.
So I think what's interesting about the Minnesota case also is just the sort of sickening creativity that occurred in this case, because, you understand with EBT fraud, people are going to, buy EBT cards for cash for 80 cents of the dollar. There's sort of this underground economy, and I'm not minimizing that. That needs to be prosecuted. That needs to be charged. But some of this stuff is just outrageous. So in the most recent case, the $1 billion, which could be much higher, it turns out that Minnesota Health and Human Services program had specific programs designed to help children that had special needs, particularly autism. And so what happened when this Somali network realized that there was money to be had? Well, in autism claims in Medicaid in Minnesota in 2018, there was a total of $3 million that was spent for people that had severe autism. By 2023, that had become $399 million. That's a 13,200% increase. I got to tell you, there's a sudden outbreak in autism in Minnesota that has never been experienced anywhere else in human history. And it just shows the ridiculous, sick nature of how they operate. They're literally taking money from a program designed to help actual kids that have autism.
An explosion in autism within the Somali community specifically.
Yes, exactly. It's like it's some contagious disease, apparently. So it's an enormous problem. And the fact is that not only did you get this sort of political protection from law enforcement officials like Ellison and also politicians in Minnesota who were kind of looking the other way, even when it was known that nonprofits were headed by somebody who was fraud, the money continued to flow. So, for example, there was a well-known Minnesota nonprofit that collected millions of dollars in state grants. The chairman of that nonprofit, it's called Cajun, I think that's how you pronounce it. The chairman of the board of that organization was convicted in a massive Medicaid fraud case. But even after he was charged, the state continued to send his organization taxpayer money.
Yeah, over $600,000 still went from Minnesota DHS to this nonprofit, even after the guy was charged in the largest Medicaid fraud case at the time. So, and that just shows you, and that's why we're sort of like trying to connect some dots. Like, why is this fraud allowed to continue to exist? Why is the Biden administration sending letters saying, no, you're not allowed to kick people off the program. Like, This is what these people are going to do. And, we had a chance to fill in for Sean Hannity last week, which was awesome. And one of the stories we talked about on the air at the time, which we also kind of couldn't believe, as this Somali story, this Somali fraud story in Minnesota, it just keeps getting bigger. But there was another story that we talked about in August. This guy gets convicted of stealing $7.2 million of taxpayer money, again, through Medicaid overbilling. He's like running a lot of different businesses all through his mailbox. The jury hears it, and the jury says, yeah, with pretty easy, pretty cut and cut and dry thing. It's like 4 hours of deliberation to come back with a conviction. The judge threw out the conviction, said the verdict was wrong, and issued a judgment of acquittal instead.
Yeah, it was a jury trial, and the jury unanimously decided that he was absolutely guilty. It took him 4.5 hours. That's all it took. Unanimous. The judge intervenes and says, no, I think it was circumstantial evidence. The judge, Sarah West, even made statements to the effect that maybe there was a cultural misunderstanding here. And the New York Times, by the way, has run a piece as well on this Somali case, essentially saying that, well, we have to understand that culturally from Somalia, this is kind of the way things get done, which to me is highly insulting. If you're a Somali, they're basically saying you're all raised to be crooks. That's essentially what the New York Times is saying.
Well, at one of the trials, actually, the guy that owns this restaurant, this fire restaurant, he did say, I mean, part of his defense was, look, it's Somali weddings. Like, people just show up. And it doesn't matter if they're invited or not. And so they do this cultural defense is interesting. And obviously it has been effective. It was effective for a time for the Minnesota Department of Education. And that's why, even though you have all the FBI is raising alarm bells, like all the people like, man, I think we've seen a massive spike in the number of meals that are allegedly being paid out. And we don't have a lot of evidence that those meals are actually making it. And when we try to do something about it, we stop shutting it down because partly of these allegations of racism.
Yeah. So let's get back to the original question I asked, which is, okay, another case of welfare fraud. Oh, it's terrible. These guys got to go to jail, but it keeps happening. And we don't seem to get any reforms from at least some politicians. And the question is why? And I think the answer why is they profit from it. They profit from it politically. They profit from it in the community. And so what do I mean by that? They're not actually pocketing money. I'm not saying that Governor Walz got any money from the scheme. He didn't. But if you look at the base of his support in Minneapolis, one of the key constituents is the highly organized, highly regimented in terms of they vote in mass in a similar way, the Somali community. So he benefits. This is one of his core constituents. So he benefits politically. He also benefits in terms of campaign donations, because one of the things that's so interesting in the case in Minneapolis, and I'm sure in these other instances, we're going to find the same thing. A lot of these guys that commit fraud actually are politically active. They donate to campaigns. They meet with political figures. The Keith Ellison tape we played earlier is a perfect illustration of that. So they're campaign donors. Some of their campaign donors are engaged in this fraudulent behavior. So if you're a crass politician, which most politicians are crass, why do you want to cut off a spigot of your support? You want to kind of ignore it. And then when it suddenly becomes so obvious that somebody is charged and is going to be convicted, then you scream, oh, this is terrible. We need to do something about it. But otherwise, you have all the upside and none of the downside for any of these politicians to do anything about this problem.
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement to make that if you're Keith Ellison, you're Tim Walsh, you're Ilhan Omar, you're not hurt politically by being good to the Somali community. In fact, you're probably not winning a Democrat primary if you're seen as cracking down on criminal activity within that community.
Right.
And so absolutely the incentive exists there. And remember, at the federal level, we saw this. One of Joe Biden's first executive orders after taking office was to say, and he said it was in the name of like enhancing access to democracy, which imagine this, just remember, Joe Biden wins in 2020, gets more votes than anybody has ever gotten in the history of mankind, like 7-8 million more votes than had existed before because of the way we conduct that election. And he's like, you know what? Democracy's under threat. What we need to do is we need to get more people to vote. And so his executive order is we're going to leverage every federal agencies that do what? Administer welfare programs, whether that's public housing or food stamps or Medicaid or all those things. And they said, anybody we engage with, we're going to use this to register people to vote. And it was obviously, weaponizing the federal government as a Democrat get out the vote machine, just in terms of the way the numbers work. And so you're absolutely right. The incentives exist. And the same thing that happens at the state level in Minnesota, they tried to do at the federal level as well.
Well, they always say money is power. Fraudulent money is also power, and it's political power for the political establishments in this case. So, yeah, I say throw the book at these people. There needs to be more of these investigations, but we really need to break down and if there's a possibility, consider prosecutions if there's crimes that have been committed by these politicians. I mean, they have a fiduciary responsibility, as far as I'm concerned, to call out corruption when they know it's going on, not to look the other way, not as Keith Ellison suggests by sending a letter to kind of tell a prosecutor to chill out. And voters ultimately need to hold them into account. I think that's the biggest frustration. People kind of have gotten used to this fraud occurring. The numbers keep getting larger, but people say, well, it's welfare fraud. It's going to happen. Oh, it's terrible. But it doesn't have to be this way. It does not have to be this way. And it doesn't have to be a partisan issue. It's become a partisan issue because I think in these ethnic communities that vote overwhelmingly Democratic, it leads Democrat politicians into this kind of protective mode. But it doesn't have to be that way. It should be a bipartisan issue to root out this problem because it is helping bankrupt the country.
It's not just helping bankrupt the country, but in Minnesota, and we've reported in not just in Minnesota, elsewhere, money literally leaves this country and goes to parts of the world that mean to do the United States harm. So it's literally taking money from the taxpayers and giving it to our enemies.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fundamentally what it is. And so when you allow fraud to go unchecked and unenforced, then you are actively harming not just our fiscal health, but our physical health as well.
Yeah, and I think also it undermines our culture because you think there are people in these communities, Somali community, who want to do the right thing. They want to work hard. They want to live the American dream, and they're seeing the guy down the street engaging in fraudulent behavior, riding around in an expensive car, buying his wife or girlfriend expensive jewelry, committing fraud, and seemingly nothing's being done about it. So it undermines the culture of America as well.
That's my favorite part about this is like, why is the dude on the Medicaid program driving a Porsche?
Right.
Like that was the
person
one
running a nonprofit.
That was the one flaw in the scheme, guys.
Yeah.
Next time you got to do a little bit better kind of, but it comes down to what they always say. Can't hide money.
Yeah, you can't hide money. And you seemingly can hide corruption, at least for a while. Well, we appreciate you as always taking the time to listen to this podcast. We know your time's valuable. You can find out more about our research at thedrilldown.com. And please consider subscribing to this podcast wherever you listen to it. Thanks again. Until next time.